Tonight, I invite you to close your eyes and let the winds of time carry you far from your room, across oceans and centuries, to a land of rolling hills, red dust, and golden sunlight, a land where empires once clashed, and farmers stood with rifles in their hands, not for conquest, but for the soil beneath their feet. You are about to drift through the story of the Boer Wars, two little understood, yet deeply pivotal conflicts that shaped not just South Africa, but the very nature of empire, resistance, and identity. But this is not just a tale of battles. No, it's a story of long journeys by ox cart, of lonely farms under starlit skies, of letters written by candlelight, and of whispered prayers in Dutch and English. It's about families torn by loyalties, about mountains that swallowed soldiers whole, and strategies written not just in ink, but in blood and silence. From the ashes of these wars rose new nations, and buried within them stories that were almost forgotten. But tonight we'll remember, not with urgency, but with reverence. Let your thoughts float as we cross rivers and Veld, sit beside weary generals, hear the crackling fire at laager camps, and walk gently through the graves of children who never asked for war. There's a strange stillness in history, a peace found only when we let the past speak. So tonight, let it speak to you. Let it whisper its truth as you sink deeper into calmness. From the colonial halls of London to the quiet resilience of Boer women in the camps, we'll walk the entire path together. So before we begin, I wonder, where are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you are? Are you tucked into a warm bed, perhaps with a lamp flickering beside you? Or listening from a quiet room somewhere far from the world? Leave a comment below. I love reading where history finds its home, where it cradles you to sleep. And if you enjoy traveling through time with me, gently, peacefully, be sure to subscribe. There are many more nights like this ahead. Hello, this is Sherry, and welcome to my channel. So, let's begin. Long before empires cast their shadows across southern Africa, before maps were drawn in London parlors, or proclamations shouted from the steps of colonial halls, there was only land. Endless, ancient land. Mountains stood like sleeping giants, their stone faces watching over plains where antelope ran free, and the winds whispered through tall grasses. The rivers, the Limpopo, the Orange, the Tugela, flowed quietly, unconcerned with the names men would later give them, beneath a sky of burning blue by day and starlit infinity by night. The southern tip of Africa held its breath. Here, time was slow, measured not in decades, but in droughts, harvests, migrations, and stories told around fires. Before the arrival of Europeans, South Africa was a tapestry of peoples and nations. The Khoisan, among the oldest surviving cultures on Earth, moved with the seasons, their footprints light upon the soil. They hunted with poisoned arrows, their tongues clicking like the songs of birds. The Bantu-speaking peoples, ancestors of the Zulu, the Xhosa, the Soto, had brought agriculture and ironwork, building chiefdoms, cattle kraals, and kingdoms that spread through the interior like the gentle unfolding of a flower. The land was not empty. It was never empty. It was full of life, language, ritual, and rhythm. And then came the sails. In 1652, the Dutch East India Company established a small resupply station at the Cape of Good Hope, just a resting post, or so they thought. But nothing stays small in history. Farmers, the Boers, as they came to be known, began to settle, to clear land, to plant vineyards and orchards, and build square white homesteads with thick walls and deep porches. These settlers were tough, pious, and insular. They saw themselves as chosen, set apart by faith and fate. As the years passed, the Dutch colonists pushed further inland. They called themselves Afrikaners. They were not Dutch anymore, not truly. The land had changed them. They grew stubborn, isolated, fiercely independent. Their language, Afrikaans, blossomed like a thorny shrub rooted in Dutch, but twisted by Africa's wind and sun. But theirs was not a peaceful advance. Conflict with native peoples began almost immediately. Land was seized, cattle stolen, treaties broken. One of the longest, most complex frontier conflicts in the world, the Boer Wars, would rage for over a century, as settlers and indigenous warriors clashed repeatedly, neither side willing to yield. And then another flag rose over the Cape. In 1806, the British seized control of the colony from the Dutch, part of the ever-shifting power plays of European empires. The British were orderly, bureaucratic, industrial. They brought railroads, taxes, schools, and a new language of command. They abolished slavery, something the Boers, whose farms had depended on it, deeply resented. They saw the British as arrogant meddlers, foreign in tongue and soul. And so the divide widened. To the British, the Boers were uncultured, stubborn farmers with outdated views. To the Boers, the British were godless imperialists who knew nothing of the land or the blood it took to tame it. It was during this time that a powerful Zulu kingdom was rising to the northeast under a warrior named Shaka. His disciplined armies and innovative tactics would reshape the region's political map, sending shockwaves through both native tribes and settler communities. It was an era of collision, cultural, economic, and spiritual. By the 1830s, thousands of Boers, refusing to live under British rule, packed their wagons and set out into the interior. This was the Great Trek, a moment of mythic importance in Afrikaner history. Families journeyed through hostile lands, over mountain passes, across rivers thick with crocodiles, guided by nothing but faith and stubbornness. They would meet Zulu impis in bloody clashes. They would build their own republics, the Orange Free State and the South African Republic, known also as the Transvaal. Two worlds had now taken shape in southern Africa, one British, modernizing, bound to the empire, seeking order and control, The other Boer, rural, independent, steeped in Calvinist righteousness and a deep sense of chosen identity. And between them, the people of the land, Africans, caught between two foreign powers that both sought dominion. The Zulu, the Xhosa, the Sodo, the Tswana nations who had ruled these lands for centuries, now facing guns, treaties, betrayals, and shifting borders. South Africa, in the middle of the 19th century, was not a nation, but a storm forming. Clouds gathered quietly on the horizon. The wind began to change. No one could yet see the fires to come, but the air, if one paid attention, had begun to taste like ash. And as the sun set over the high Veld, turning the sky to blood and gold, a sense of inevitability drifted through the air. It was no longer a question of if war would come, only when. And so, with the dust still undisturbed and the thunder yet to break, we end our first chapter and step closer to the coming fire. In the next part of our journey, we'll ride with the Boers as they leave behind all they've known and travel into the unknown heart of the continent. In what will become the Great Trek, it began with a decision, quiet, painful, but resolute. By the early 1830s, the Boers of the Cape Colony stood at a crossroads. They had long endured British control, but recent changes had gone too far. The final blow came in 1834, when the British formally abolished slavery throughout their empire. For the Boers, this was not merely an economic hardship, but a moral insult. Their faith told them the world was ordered by God, and in that order, they were chosen stewards of the land and of those beneath them. To them, this wasn't just about labor. It was about the right to live as they believed, to follow their laws, their God, their way. And so they turned their backs to the Cape and looked northward. What followed was not just a migration, it was an exodus. Wagons were loaded with Bibles, rifles, flour, dried meat, children, and hope. Oxen were yoked. Prayers were spoken. And then, slowly, the long white wagons began to roll. This was the Great Trek. Over 10,000 Boers would leave the British Cape between the 1830s and 1850s, spreading into the vast interior like drifting leaves on the wind. They were called voortrekkers, pioneers, those who trek ahead. Their journey was harsh and uncertain. Some died of disease, others were ambushed, but they pressed on, believing they were carving out a covenant with the land, a new Israel in Africa. The land they entered was far from empty. In the east, they would encounter the great Zulu kingdom, whose power radiated from a fierce, brilliant, and feared king, Shaka Zulu. To understand the voortrekkers' fate, one must first understand the power they were walking into. The Zulu kingdom had risen rapidly in the early 19th century. Shaka had transformed his people into a disciplined military machine. With short, stabbing spears and tight formations, the Zulu impis swept across the region, displacing smaller tribes and forging an empire through blood and order. When the voortrekkers reached Natal, fertile, green, beautiful, They thought they had found their promised land. But this land was claimed. Negotiations with the Zulu king Dingaan, Shaka's successor, began with cautious words and ended with a massacre. At a place called Blaukrans, dozens of Voortrekker families, men, women, and children, were slaughtered in the night. The reaction was swift, and it was final. Under the leadership of Andries Pretorius, the Boers gathered their wagons into a circle, a lager, and prepared for battle. On December 16, 1838, at the banks of a quiet river, they met a Zulu force of over 10,000 warriors. The Boers numbered fewer than 500, but they had muskets, and they believed God was on their side. They prayed before the battle. They made a vow to God. If they were delivered from their enemies, they would forever honor that day. And so came the Battle of Blood River. It was not a battle, but a slaughter. The Zulu charged wave after wave, their courage astonishing, but muskets cut them down. The river ran red. Over 3,000 Zulu warriors were killed. The Boers suffered only a few wounds. The Voortrekkers saw it not as luck, but as divine confirmation. Their victory was proof, they believed, that they had been chosen to settle this land, that God had smiled upon their struggle. They kept their vow. December 16 would become Day of the Vow, a sacred date in Afrikaner culture for generations. Out of this blood and belief, a new identity was born. No longer simply Dutch farmers, the Boers now saw themselves as a people forged by suffering, chosen by destiny. The wilderness had shaped them. The wars had hardened them. Their language, Afrikaans, was now fully distinct from its Dutch roots, simplified and sun-baked. Their churches became the heart of their new communities. Their rifles stood beside their Bibles. They established republics, the Natal Republic in the east, though the British would annex it shortly after, the Orange Free State, and the South African Republic, known commonly as the Transvaal. These were not grand capitals of marble and empire. They were towns with dirt roads, tin roofs, and modest parliaments. But they were free, and to the Boers, that was everything. Still, freedom was fragile. Life in the interior was not easy. Droughts killed crops. Raids were frequent. British expansion loomed like a shadow in the south. And neighboring African kingdoms, the Basotho under Mashushu, the Petty, the Tswana, were far from passive. There were alliances, betrayals, skirmishes, and always the quiet hum of tension. Yet the Boers endured. They taught their children to ride, to shoot, to pray. They buried their dead with psalms. Their hymns echoed across the veldt at dawn. The church bell was their compass. Their republics, though small, were fiercely proud. They printed their own money, passed their own laws, and insisted, again and again, that they wanted only to be left alone. But history does not often leave people alone. The British were watching, and they were not just watching the Boers, they were watching the land. Because soon, the earth would begin to glitter. And when it did, the whole world would turn its gaze upon South Africa. The wagons have stopped now. The dust has settled, but not for long. Because in the next chapter, something begins to shimmer beneath the soil, something that will bring the weight of empire crashing down once again. In Section 3, we'll unearth the story of diamonds, gold, and the greed that changed everything. There are moments in history when the land itself betrays its people. Moments when the soil cracks open, not from drought or war, but from the weight of something deeper, something older, something precious. In the late 1860s, in a dry riverbed along the banks of the Orange River, a young boy named Erasmus Jacobs picked up a strange, shiny stone. It glinted in the sun. No one knew it then, but that small glimmer would ignite a fire greater than any war before it. For the stone Erasmus found was a diamond, and it would be only the first of many. Soon after, a second, larger diamond was discovered nearby. Then another, and another. The news spread like wildfire across farms, across towns, across oceans. And suddenly, the world began to turn its gaze towards southern Africa. The Boers, who had long wanted to be left in peace, found their world invaded not by armies, but by pickaxes and foreign tongues. Prospectors arrived in droves, from Britain, from Australia, from India, from America. These fortune seekers were called diggers, and they came with nothing but shovels and dreams. They poured into the region, forming dusty camps and chaotic towns, all orbiting a single, shimmering idea: wealth. One of the largest and most infamous of these camps would become Kimberley. A haphazard explosion of tents, noise, and ambition. Here, beneath the blistering sun and the cries of mule trains, men dug into the earth with frenzy. They carved out what would later be called the Big Hole, a man-made abyss that swallowed land and life alike. With the diamonds came industry, and with industry came the British. They saw in the chaos an opportunity, not just for profit, but for control. The region where the diamonds were discovered was contested territory, claimed by the Boers, the British, and local African tribes alike. The British moved quickly, annexing the land under the name of the Griqualand West Colony. The Boers protested, of course, but protest means little when wealth is involved. Still, they were farmers, not financiers. They watched, uneasy, as their rural world filled with steam engines, banks, and men in top hats. Foreign newspapers printed headlines about the African diamond rush. Railroads crept forward like iron serpents, and yet that was only the beginning. Because what lay beneath the Veld was far greater than diamonds. In 1886, in a place called Witwatersrand, near what would later become Johannesburg, prospectors struck something even more profound: gold, not flakes, not tiny seams, vast reefs of it. Suddenly, the British Empire, the greatest financial power of its day, had a new priority. It was no longer simply about strategic control or spreading civilization. It was about the earth itself. The Boer republics, The Transvaal and the Orange Free State now sat atop unimaginable wealth, and that made them a threat, because the gold belonged, in British eyes, not to farmers with Bibles, but to the Empire. The Transvaal, under its president Paul Kruger, sought to retain control of the goldfields. But it was a losing battle. Thousands of Uitlanders, foreign workers and businessmen, poured into Johannesburg. These new arrivals paid taxes, but had no rights, and they began to protest. The British, ever watchful, used this unrest as moral leverage. They began to position their interest not as greed, but as justice. It was a clever disguise. Kruger, a stubborn and deeply religious man, saw what was happening. His people, who had fought, bled, and prayed for their independence, were now being outnumbered, outspent, and outmaneuvered. But he would not yield. In London, however, plans were already forming. At the center of them stood a name that would shape the coming storm: Cecil Rhodes. Rhodes was not just a man. He was an idea, empire personified. He believed in British supremacy, in the manifest right to rule, and in the unification of Africa under one flag. He had grown rich from diamonds, owning the De Beers Company, which monopolized the industry, and he now turned his eyes toward the gold. In 1895, with Rhodes' backing, a disastrous plan unfolded: the Jameson Raid. A group of armed men, led by Dr. Leander Starr Jameson, attempted to incite a rebellion among the Uitlanders in the Transvaal, hoping it would justify British intervention. But the raid failed. The Boers captured the invaders. Rhodes resigned in disgrace. Yet the damage was done. Trust was shattered. Lines were drawn. And the idea of war, once distant, was now being spoken aloud in drawing rooms, in churches, in whispers across both empires and farms. The Boers began to mobilize. The British began to build. There was a sense, unspoken, but deeply felt, that the next war would not be like the last. It would not be short or honorable or easily forgotten. It would be modern. It would be vast. It would change everything. And all because of what lay beneath the soil: glittering stones, golden veins, and the silent promise of power. The sun sets now over Johannesburg, casting long shadows across mine shafts and train tracks. But in the quiet, a murmur rises of armies being prepared, of borders growing tense. In our next chapter, the storm will break. The First Boer War is about to begin, and the world will watch with surprise as farmers take up arms and bring an empire to its knees. In the closing months of 1880, the South African Veld felt restless. The horizon was unchanged, golden grasses swaying gently beneath the sun, kopjes rising like sleeping beasts across the landscape. But beneath that tranquil facade, a fuse had been lit. The First Boer War, also called the First Anglo-Boer War, was not a war of grand battles or sweeping campaigns. It was, in truth, a brief, bitter, and oddly personal conflict. But like all things that change the world, it began with a seemingly small act of defiance. And it started with attacks. For years, tension had grown between the British and the Boers of the South African Republic, also known as the Transvaal. The Republic had fallen into debt and disorder in the 1870s. And in 1877, the British had seized the moment, annexing the territory under the justification of bringing stability. They believed the Boers would protest, but eventually accept. They didn't. Instead, quiet resistance took root. Men gathered in dusty town halls. Letters were written to London, petitions drafted. Preachers urged the people not to kneel, but the British, confident in their authority, ignored the murmurs. Then, in 1880, came a moment that changed everything seemingly small, and yet utterly combustible. A Boer farmer named Piet Bezuidenhout refused to pay a tax. His wagon was seized by British officials in the town of Potchefstroom. In response, a group of armed Boers rode in and reclaimed it by force, declaring they would no longer recognize British rule. The British laughed at first, but they shouldn't have. Within days, the South African Republic was reborn. The Boers formed a provisional government at Heidelberg. Paul Kruger, Piet Joubert, and Marthinus Wessel Pretorius, veterans of many struggles, stood again at the helm. Commandos were called up. Prayers were said, and war unmistakable and irreversible began. It was December 1880. The British, confident in their military superiority, dispatched small garrisons across the Transvaal to hold the towns, but these outposts were scattered, undersupplied, and ill-prepared. The Boers, by contrast, knew the land. They had no formal uniforms, but they had horses, hunting rifles, and most importantly, conviction. They weren't fighting for empire. They were fighting for home. Their strategy was clear: isolate the British, besiege their positions, and force a surrender before reinforcements could arrive from overseas. It worked. Within weeks, several towns, including Pretoria, Potchefstroom, and Lydenburg, were surrounded. But the real shock came not in these quiet sieges, but on the battlefield. On 20 December 1880, a small British column was ambushed at Bronkhorstspruit. Lieutenant Colonel Anstruther had been leading 250 men toward Pretoria when they were halted by a Boer delegation, who politely, almost apologetically, requested their surrender. Anstruther refused. The Boers opened fire. Within minutes, 155 British soldiers were killed or wounded. The survivors surrendered. It was a stunning blow. The British, stunned by what they saw as the audacity of farmers, began to realize this war would not follow the rules. But the true humiliation came at Laing's Neck. Situated near the Natal border, Laing's Neck was a strategic mountain pass. In late January 1881, British Major General Sir George Colley led a force of over 1,200 men to take it. The Boers were entrenched on the heights, dug in with deadly precision. The British advanced, bayonets gleaming, standards held high, and they were cut down. Wave after wave fell beneath Boer rifle fire. Within minutes, hundreds lay dead or wounded. Kali withdrew, shaken, but still he persisted. On 8 February, he tried again at Schuenschucht and was again driven back. Then came the final blow, Majuba Hill. On the night of 26 February 1881, Kali attempted a surprise attack. He led 400 men to the summit of Majuba, hoping to catch the Boers off guard from above. At first, the plan seemed to succeed. The British held the high ground, but the Boers, fearless and sure-footed, climbed the hill under cover of dawn. They attacked from below, swiftly, silently, with deadly accuracy. The British were thrown into chaos. Kali himself was shot and killed, a bullet piercing his head as he gave orders. His men, leaderless and panicked, broke ranks and fled down the slopes, only to be pursued and cut down. Over 90 British soldiers died that day. The Boers suffered only one fatality. The Empire, humiliated, bloodied, and suddenly unsure, sued for peace. The Treaty of Pretoria was signed in August 1881. Though the British retained nominal suzerainty, the South African Republic effectively regained its independence. The Boers rejoiced. Church bells rang across the Transvaal. Commandos returned home to farms and families. They had beaten the Empire not just once, but 3 times. But in London, the mood was bitter. Pride had been wounded, and while the First Boer War ended, it did not resolve. It smoldered like embers beneath ash. The British would remember Majuba. They would not forget the flag lowered in shame. And the Boers, proud and defiant, believed their freedom was secure. But they were wrong. Because while rifles were silenced, the ground beneath them was still glowing with gold, with diamonds, with the weight of imperial appetite. Night falls over Majuba now, still and silent. But the ghosts remain. In the distance, the land exhales, briefly at peace, but knowing full well that peace never lasts long in places rich with blood and treasure. In our next chapter, we will walk into the often overlooked battlegrounds of this first war, the Forgotten War, where sieges and skirmishes spoke louder than any speech. Some wars are remembered for their glory, others for their horror, but some are remembered only by the soil. The First Boer War is one such war. To most of the world, it was a strange flicker, brief, undignified, and barely understood. Yet for those who lived through it, for those who crouched behind stone walls or nursed the wounded by lantern light, it was not brief at all. It was fire. It was fear. It was everything. Let us walk gently through the scattered chapters of this forgotten war, where small towns became fortresses, and ordinary men found themselves etched into the story of an empire. Potchefstroom. The long silence. Our journey begins in the town of Potchefstroom, where the war's first shots had flared. Here, a British garrison of 213 men found themselves quickly surrounded by Boer commandos. What followed was not a glorious siege, but a long, cold endurance. For 95 days, they held out behind makeshift walls, drinking rainwater, rationing hardtack, and listening, always, for the next volley of rifle fire. Communication with the outside world was cut. In this stillness, time seemed to stretch. Days were marked not by the sun, but by gunshots. And yet the British held. They refused to surrender, believing reinforcements would come. They didn't know the truth, that the war was already nearing its end elsewhere. When the treaty was finally signed and the garrison surrendered, bitterness remained. Some Boers had fired even after the ceasefire, and many British soldiers accused them of betrayal. The town, small and dust-choked, bore witness to this confusion. A war ending not with fanfare, but with silence, suspicion, and the scent of black powder lingering in the wind. Lydenburg, the stand in the hills high in the misty foothills of the Drakensberg Mountains, lies Lydenburg, another town caught in the war's quiet fury. A British force stationed there found themselves blockaded by local Boer fighters, not professional soldiers, but farmers with old rifles, deep knowledge of the terrain, and an unshakable purpose. For 84 days, the siege dragged on. Here, too, the story was one of resilience. British troops, surrounded and cut off, dug trenches, reinforced buildings, and waited. Food supplies dwindled. Ammunition became scarce, but they survived, despite sporadic shelling and Boer sniper fire from the hills above. In the towns nearby, women and children watched the skies, praying for it to end. The siege of Lydenburg is little remembered in textbooks, but its meaning lingers. That war, even in its smallest corners, holds the power to reshape lives forever. Standerton, a bitter wind in the south, near the Vaal River, lay Standerton, where Captain Lambert and a small British force made their stand. The garrison was outnumbered and undersupplied. Easy prey, one might think. But Standerton's defenders were resourceful. They fortified the local schoolhouse and dug defensive ditches around the town. Each morning brought a cold wind from the plains, and with it, a thin tension, the kind that clings to your skin and settles in your chest. The Boers, crouching in the long grass, used hit-and-run tactics, disappearing before anyone could see their faces. Children in the town learned to hide when the wind changed. Dogs barked at shadows, and each dusk felt like a prayer unanswered. The siege lifted after the treaty, and Standerton faded back into obscurity. But for those who had stood there, soaked in mud, trembling in the half-light, it was unforgettable. Rustenburg and Marabastad, outposts in the wild further afield, small outposts like Rustenburg and Marabastad, saw brief but sharp confrontations. These were not battles in the grand sense, no banners, no formations. They were ambushes, surprise assaults, defensive retreats. At Rustenburg, British troops were holed up in the magistrate's office. They melted down lead pipes to make bullets. They boiled leather for food. Locals risked their lives to carry messages through Boer lines. At Marabastad, a tiny northern post near the Limpopo, British officers held out against constant threats, knowing that if they fell, no one would come for them. These were lonely places, and yet they were part of something much larger. They remind us that war doesn't always happen in the headlines. Sometimes it happens in shacks, in ravines, in whispered warnings carried by wind. Laing's Neck, the high pass of hubris. We must return now to the great mountain pass of Laing's Neck. The British, still reeling from earlier losses, had believed they could punch through this natural barrier and break the siege lines. The terrain was steep, the Boer positions almost invisible, and the path forward suicidal. But pride prevailed over caution. On 28 January 1881, the British 58th Regiment advanced, kilts, muskets, bayonets, and all, against a deeply entrenched Boer force. They were cut down in waves. Major Hingiston was killed at the front. Captain Maud fell beside his drummer boy. Men scrambled up the rocks only to tumble back down, their red coats darkened with blood and dust. The defeat was so total, so shocking, that it shook military confidence back in London. It wasn't just a loss, it was a warning. This enemy could not be dismissed. Majuba Hill, the echo that never fades. We end this journey, inevitably, at Majuba Hill, though we've already glimpsed its outcome in our last chapter. But it bears repeating, not in facts, but in feeling. For to climb Majuba is to feel time stop, to stand at its summit, even now, is to see what Kali saw that day. The valleys below, the shifting shadows of the Boers climbing upward, the moment when the illusion of imperial invincibility shattered like glass. It wasn't just a military defeat. It was a spiritual one. For an empire that had stretched across continents, ruled seas, and rewritten maps, to be humbled by men in wide-brimmed hats, armed with old rifles and a prayer, was unthinkable, but it had happened. And Majuba would become more than a hill. It would become a grudge. Now, the last shots of the First Boer War have faded into memory. The sieges are lifted. The towns go quiet, but nothing truly ends in history, not completely. Because in the next chapter, peace arrives, but it is peace with a bitter taste. In Section 6, we walk through the uneasy calm, where wounds are hidden, not healed, and the seeds of a far greater war are quietly, slowly, being sown. The war had ended, but the silence that followed was heavy. It wasn't the comforting quiet of peace. It was the kind that seeps into the cracks of old buildings, the kind that sits behind the eyes of men who have seen too much, and know, deep down, that it isn't truly over. In 1881, the Treaty of Pretoria was signed. It brought a kind of closure to the First Boer War, at least on paper. Britain, wounded in pride, but eager to prevent further humiliation, agreed to restore internal self-government to the Transvaal. There was a condition, of course. The Republic would remain under the vague umbrella of British suzerainty, a term so nebulous that both sides interpreted it differently. For the Boers, it meant they had won their independence. For the British, it meant the door was still open, that they had merely stepped back, not walked away. But in truth, the war had changed something fundamental. It had shaken the British Empire's image of itself. The Redcoats had marched confidently into South Africa and been turned away by farmers with hunting rifles and fierce conviction. And that defeat, that public, humiliating defeat, was a wound the Empire would carry with quiet resentment. Meanwhile, back in the Transvaal, the victors returned home, not to cheers or riches, but to fields overgrown, homes in disrepair, and the endless labor of rebuilding. There was no triumph, only relief. Many Boers returned to their farms and chapels, bowed not by defeat, but by the weight of survival. Among them was Paul Kruger. Deeply religious, cautious, and weathered by life in the Veld, Kruger would rise to become the face of the Republic. By 1883, he had been elected president of the South African Republic. His speeches were simple, often quoting scripture. His beard was long, his voice steady. To the Boers, he was not a politician, but a guardian, someone who understood the land, their fears, their stubborn pride. And yet, even as the Republic mended itself, the world around it was beginning to change. Beneath its very feet, it was gold, that eternal tempter, that began to rewrite the story. In 1886, a discovery was made in the dusty ridges of the Witwatersrand, a seam of gold so vast, so deep, that it would become one of the richest deposits in the world. Overnight, the quiet Veld transformed. Camps became towns. Towns became cities. Johannesburg, once a lonely ridge with nothing but antelope and scrub grass, roared to life in just a few years. Foreigners poured in: British, Australians, Germans, Americans, chasing fortune. These newcomers, known as Uitlanders, filled the streets, built banks and hotels, and dug their way into the earth with dynamite and steel. Their wealth surged, but politically, they were nothing. Kruger's government refused them voting rights, fearing they would overrun Boer values, flood the ballot box, and turn the Republic into an English colony by sheer numbers alone. To the Boers, the Uitlanders were interlopers. To the Uitlanders, Kruger was a tyrant. This tension grew year by year, feeding fires in both directions. The British Empire, which had reluctantly stepped back after the First Boer War, now watched the Transvaal with renewed interest. The gold mines were vital, not just for wealth, but for the economic lifeblood of the empire. London's banks were tied to South African gold, and the idea that this treasure was under the control of a stubborn republic of farmers, it grated deeply. Cecil Rhodes, Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, and perhaps the most imperial mind of his generation, saw the situation as untenable. He believed it was Britain's destiny to control all of southern Africa, to bring unity and British order to the region. The Boers, in his mind, stood in the way of history. So tensions brewed. They brewed in the smoky bars of Johannesburg, where Uitlanders grumbled over ale. They brewed in Pretoria, where Kruger's advisors debated how to maintain sovereignty without provoking war. They brewed in London, where imperialists lobbied for action, and in Cape Town, where Rhodes schemed, quietly building toward confrontation. Then came the spark that nearly lit the fire too soon, the Jameson Raid. In December 1895, Leander Starr Jameson, a loyal follower of Rhodes, led an armed force into the Transvaal with the intent of inciting a Uitlander uprising in Johannesburg. It was a disastrous miscalculation. The uprising never materialized. The Boers captured Jameson and his men, and the raid collapsed into embarrassment. The British government, caught off guard, publicly condemned the act. Rhodes resigned in disgrace, but the damage had been done. Kruger no longer had any doubt. Britain would not stop until it controlled the Transvaal again. The raid had proven that, and back in London, the failure stung. It became yet another humiliation, another insult added to the legacy of Majuba Hill. It stirred the old wounds and deepened the appetite for revenge. After the raid, both sides began to prepare in earnest. The Boers bought modern rifles and German artillery, fortified key positions, and trained their commando units in the hills. The British expanded their military presence in the Cape and Natal, extending railways northward, readying troops and materiel. The air was tense, even in peace. By 1898, Kruger had been re-elected once more, but the tone had changed. His speeches were darker now, full of warnings and scripture about betrayal, judgment, and war. He saw the British demands for Uitlander voting rights not as justice, but as a pretext for domination. He was not wrong. In October 1899, the final ultimatum arrived. Britain demanded the disarmament of the Boer republics and the immediate extension of political rights to foreigners. Kruger's response was swift, an ultimatum of his own: withdraw British troops from their borders within 48 hours or face war. The British refused, and so the silence finally broke. It began, as war so often does, not with a bang, but with the slow, rhythmic clatter of hooves. Boer commandos crossed the border into British territory, striking first, not out of hatred, but because they feared what would come if they didn't. Once again, South Africa was at war, but this would be no brief, gentleman's skirmish like before. This would be a war that would burn through cities, bury empires, and break the old world apart. Now, in our next chapter, we ride into the storm. The Second Boer War begins, and with it, one of the most brutal and transformative chapters in the story of modern imperial history. The year was 1899, and the land beneath South Africa trembled not from nature, but from the weight of decisions made far away, in polished halls, under chandeliers, over the shuffle of papers and the clinking of teacups. In London, the air was thick with talk of duty, empire, and justice. In Pretoria, it was filled with prayers and the tightening of belts. The world was not at war yet, but it could feel it coming. It was there, in the clipped voices of telegrams, in the rattling of railway tracks carrying soldiers north, in the fingers of mothers brushing dirt from their sons' uniforms. A war, once unthinkable, was now inevitable. Tensions had been winding tighter for years, a rope pulled by pride, greed, and history. The discovery of gold in the Transvaal had made the stakes clearer and the players bolder. The British had not forgotten the sting of their earlier defeat, and the Boers had not forgotten the taste of independence. But it wasn't the gold alone that set the match. It was the growing, smoldering question of rights. The British claimed they wanted fairness, political representation for the Uitlanders, the mostly British immigrants who now made up a majority in cities like Johannesburg. They worked the mines, paid the taxes, built the roads, and yet had no voice in the state that ruled them. On paper, the demand was just, but behind the language of justice lay something else, a desire to absorb the Republic entirely, to bring it under the imperial banner once and for all. President Kruger, aged and worn, still unshakable in his convictions, saw it all with clear eyes. He believed the British demands were a trick, that if the Boers gave an inch, the Empire would take the Veld, the cities, and their sovereignty. He moved cautiously, but with resolve. He fortified borders, summoned the burghers, and prayed more than he slept. As the months passed, the diplomatic language grew more brittle. Each letter between London and Pretoria sounded more like a warning. By September, British troops were gathering along the Transvaal's border, not yet marching, but waiting, watching. The railways brought them daily, young men in pressed uniforms, wide-eyed and joking, unaware of the fire they would soon walk into. And then it came, a letter not of diplomacy, but of finality. On October 9, 1899, the South African Republic delivered an ultimatum to Britain. It was not written in anger, but in resolve. It stated plainly, if British forces did not withdraw from the borders within 48 hours, the Boers would consider it an act of war. It was, in truth, a desperate message. Kruger knew the British would never withdraw, but he also knew he could not afford to wait for them to strike first. In a war of movement, perhaps the Boers had a chance. In a war of defense, surrounded and blockaded, they would wither. Britain's response came not with ink, but steel. On October 11, 1899, war was declared. The Empire stirred. In London, bells tolled. In Cape Town, regiments gathered. In Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, volunteers began to organize. Across the Empire, there was a strange sense of excitement, as if the coming war would be brief, a proud march through a stubborn little republic. They thought it would be over by Christmas. They were wrong. Within days of the declaration, Boer commandos surged into British territory. These were not armies in the European sense. They were irregular fighters farmers with rifles, organized into mobile units that moved fast and struck hard. They knew the terrain, the hills, the dry riverbeds, and the secret paths through the tall grass. They had fought before, and they were ready. They moved into Natal, besieging the towns of Ladysmith, Mafeking, and Kimberley. The British, caught off guard, scrambled to reinforce. For weeks, the Boers held the advantage, their mobility and determination overwhelming the unprepared imperial garrisons. But while the world watched the opening battles, something darker was forming just beneath the surface. A quiet, creeping dread that this war would not be like the last. This time, the British were not merely embarrassed. They were enraged, and this time, they would not hold back. Back in London, as reports of sieges and setbacks trickled in, the public mood turned from curiosity to fury. Parliament authorized massive troop deployments. Veterans were recalled, new regiments were raised. From India, from Canada, from the far corners of the empire, men were sent into the fire. The Boers had struck first, and now the empire would answer. But what no one yet saw, not Kruger, not Chamberlain, not the young men boarding ships in Southampton, was that this war would not be fought in the manner of the old ones. There would be no clear lines, no glorious charges. This war would be one of attrition, of scorched fields and shattered homesteads. And when the smoke lifted, it would leave behind scars not only in the soil, but in the very soul of South Africa. By the close of 1899, the battles had begun in earnest, and they would only grow bloodier. The sieges deepened, the weather turned, supplies dwindled. In the hills, the Boers huddled by fires, clutching rifles and singing old psalms. In the British camps, soldiers dug trenches, watched the stars, and wrote letters home, unsure if they would ever see those shores again. It is here, at the edge of 1900, that we stand looking into the dark heart of the Second Boer War. The war has begun, but its nature, its true cost, is still hidden just beyond the smoke. In our next chapter, we'll walk together into the battles that shaped it, where steel met soil, where resolve was tested, and where history bent under the weight of two nations colliding. It is December now, 1899, and summer has come to South Africa. But there is little warmth in the air, only the dry heat of marching men, the crack of distant rifles, and the rising stench of war. In London, the mood has shifted. What had once seemed a swift colonial expedition had turned sour. The Boer commandos, ununiformed, unorthodox, and infuriatingly mobile, had captured the world's attention. The empire, despite its grandeur, was being tested by farmers with Mausers and horses. The sieges gripped British-held towns like clenched fists. In Ladysmith, British soldiers and civilians found themselves trapped, their supply lines cut, their escape impossible. Days stretched into weeks. Hunger gnawed. Disease crept through the makeshift hospitals. Every sunrise brought the whine of shells from Boer artillery. Every sunset, the burial of another comrade. In Kimberley, another siege, and in Mafeking, a name the world would come to know, Colonel Robert Baden-Powell held out with a strange mix of improvisation and theatricality, bluffing the Boers with fake cannons made of oil drums and tireless propaganda. The world cheered his defiance, but the suffering inside the town was real. Starvation doesn't pause for cleverness. These sieges were more than just military actions. They were a humiliation, a deeply personal insult to British pride. And so London prepared a response. It came not in whispers, but with the thunder of boots. General Sir Redvers Buller was appointed commander of British forces in South Africa. He was a heavy man with a heavy presence, silent, brooding, and decorated. But while Buller carried the medals of old wars, he also carried their outdated assumptions. The British military machine, vast and proud, now bore down on South Africa. Thousands of troops poured into the country, infantry, cavalry, artillery, all painted in the khaki of empire. From the hills of Scotland, the streets of Manchester, and the countryside of Sussex, young men arrived under a sun they did not understand, to fight an enemy they barely knew. Their goal was simple: break the Boer sieges, liberate the towns, crush the republics. But they did not understand the Veld, that great rolling openness, dry and deceptive. They did not understand the Boer commandos, who fought not in lines, but in ambushes, who could melt into the scrub grass and appear behind you. The Boers had no uniforms, no bugles, no parades. They had patience and knowledge of the land. And so began one of the darkest chapters of the war. It was December 10th, when General Gathacker, attempting to retake the small town of Stormberg, led his men into the night. They marched in darkness, through unknown terrain, cold and hungry, only to be ambushed at dawn. Disoriented, outgunned, the British fled in chaos. Over 600 were killed, wounded, or captured. 3 days later, at Magersfontein, another blow. Lord Methuen, moving to relieve Kimberley, faced the Duggan Boers, who had prepared perfectly. The Highland Brigade advanced in early morning mist, bagpipes playing, kilts fluttering, only to walk straight into rifle fire. The Boers had not waited on the hills, as the British expected, but had buried themselves in the earth at the base. The result was a massacre. The cries of the wounded echoed across the sand. Hundreds fell in minutes. The living lay flat, unable to move, baking in the sun. And then came Colenso. General Buller himself led the attack, aiming to cross the Tugela River and relieve Ladysmith. But poor reconnaissance, miscommunication, and underestimation of Boer positions led to disaster. British troops were caught in open ground. Artillery was captured. Entire units became disoriented and exposed. Buller ordered a retreat. 3 battles, 3 defeats. They would come to be known as Black Week. In the space of 7 days, the mighty British Empire had been bloodied by a republic smaller than Ireland. Newspapers in London screamed. Political pressure mounted. The Prime Minister reeled. For the first time in decades, the image of imperial invincibility cracked. Yet, in South Africa, the mood was not triumphant. Among the Boers, there was little celebration, only the tightening of belts, the cleaning of rifles, and the quiet understanding that the worst was yet to come. Because while the empire had stumbled, it had not fallen. It was learning, and it would return with a fury. The defeats sparked reform. General Buller, though not yet dismissed, was now quietly sidelined. In his place came Lord Roberts, a veteran of India, and by his side, a man who would become infamous, Lord Kitchener. Roberts was methodical, calm, a planner. Kitchener was colder, more ruthless, and utterly devoted to victory at any cost. Together, they would shift the war's direction. But before that, the cost of Black Week had to be paid. Thousands of young men lay buried in the Veld, under makeshift crosses and piles of stone. Letters home went unanswered. Families in Manchester and Belfast, in Brisbane and Halifax, mourned silently by their hearths, the pride of patriotism curdling into grief. The war had changed. No longer a bold campaign, it had become a grind. The Boers, too, began to understand the weight of what was coming. They were fighting not just an army, but an empire that had now shed its illusions. And empires, once angered, do not retreat, they devour. And so, the wind shifted once again. The British regathered. A new wave of soldiers arrived. More modern weapons were shipped in. Railway lines were fortified and expanded. Telegrams flew like lightning. The imperial machine, once sluggish, was now awake and moving. Ahead lay some of the war's most decisive battles, the turning point where the might of empire would finally begin to overwhelm the raw courage of the republics. But as we will see in our next chapter, brute force would not bring peace. No, the war was about to become something much darker, a fight not just over territory, but over the land itself, over homes, over families, over survival. When we continue, we will follow Lord Roberts as he takes command and marches north. A path paved in steel, sacrifice, and shadows. The new century dawned in South Africa beneath a haze of gunpowder and smoke. It was January 1900, and the long, weary hours of the Second Boer War ticked on without mercy. But something had shifted. The man now commanding British forces was not Buller. With his hesitation and haunted eyes, it was Field Marshal Lord Roberts, a figure who carried the cold confidence of the Victorian military class. His eyes, bright and hard, missed little. His voice, gentle yet commanding, calmed men even in the heat of battle. He was small in stature, but what he lacked in height, he carried in resolve. Roberts came to South Africa with a singular goal: break the back of the Boer resistance. His strategy was bold and swift. Rather than focus solely on relieving the besieged towns, Roberts planned a grand advance, northward through the Orange Free State and into the Transvaal. His eye was on Bloemfontein, then Pretoria, and finally Johannesburg, the jewel of the goldfields. To help him, he brought a quiet, calculating mind. Lord Kitchener. If Roberts was the face of the operation, Kitchener was its steel spine. He spoke rarely. He planned constantly. And in his notebooks, he began to scribble ideas not just for battles, but for what would come after. In February 1900, the campaign began in earnest. But first, a victory, one sorely needed. At the Battle of Paardeberg, the Boers, led by General Cringey, made the fatal mistake of digging in near the Modder River. For 9 days, the British encircled the camp. Trenches grew closer by the hour. The siege was suffocating. The Boers, trapped and bombarded, could not escape. On the morning of February 27th, the same day as Majuba Day, a bitter anniversary for Britain, Cringey surrendered with over 4,000 men. The news exploded across British newspapers. The ghosts of Majuba were finally buried, or so it seemed. The morale within the empire surged. The humiliations of Black Week faded in the face of hard-won success. Roberts continued north. The railway lines behind him groaned with supplies. The Veld, dry and endless, seemed to stretch open before the advancing columns. By March, Roberts had taken Bloemfontein, the capital of the Orange Free State. It was a quiet city, its streets swept by warm winds, its people weary and watchful. The Boer government had fled. In the capital's heart, British flags now fluttered. But though the territory was taken, the war was not won. There was an uneasy silence in Bloemfontein. British troops, unused to the heat and dust, fell ill. Typhoid swept through the camps. Graves multiplied. The war, even in victory, was demanding a price, and ahead still lay the heart of the enemy, the Transvaal. Roberts pressed on. In May, Johannesburg, the city built on gold, fell. Not with thunder, but with silence. The Boers, realizing the strength of the advancing British, had abandoned it. The mines were sabotaged. The streets were quiet. The city that had ignited the fuse of the war now lay beneath British control. 1 week later, on June 5th, the Union Jack was raised over Pretoria. The Transvaal capital, once the seat of President Kruger's defiance, was now in British hands. The telegraph lines trembled with the news. Victory, many believed, was all but declared. But they were wrong. The fall of the capitals, though symbolically powerful, did not break the Boer resistance. Far from it. In fact, it only transformed the war. Because as the British celebrated and the world declared the empire victorious, the Boers disappeared. Into the land, into the hills, into the dust. They did not surrender. They shifted. Commandos, now scattered and desperate, abandoned formal battle. They turned to guerrilla warfare, fast raids, ambushes, the blowing up of rail lines, the stealing of supplies. They attacked under moonlight and vanished before dawn. The empire, expecting surrender, found itself chasing shadows. Lord Roberts, tired and ill, returned to Britain in late 1900, hailed as a hero. But the job was unfinished. In his place, Lord Kitchener took command, and with him came a colder war. In the wake of the Boer retreat, British troops scorched the earth behind them. Farms were burned, wells poisoned, fields salted, livestock slaughtered. The aim was simple: starve the resistance. But it was not only the fighters who paid the price. Women and children, the families of Boer soldiers, were herded from the burned ruins of their homes and sent to camps, makeshift, unsanitary, and overcrowded. These concentration camps would become one of the darkest chapters in British military history. But that is a story for our next quiet moment together. For now, the year is 1900, and while Pretoria has fallen, the war has merely changed form. In the hills and Veld, Boer fighters ride still, hungry, angry, and unwilling to yield. Their homeland, reduced to ash in many places, still sings beneath their feet. And so they fight not just for politics, but for memory, for blood, for home. In our next chapter, we will follow this transformation, the desperate, daring, and often tragic guerrilla phase of the war, where heroes are hunted and vengeance walks beside the wind. The sun had set over the capitals, but not over the war. In the Veld and koppies, in the gullies and thorn-choked ravines, the Boers had become ghosts. They no longer wore the burden of uniform or the vulnerability of fixed position. They moved with the wind, struck like lightning, and vanished again into the land that bore them. This was no longer a war of lines and flags. It was now a war of whispers, of hooves in the night, saboteurs in the brush, and rifles that spoke only when they had to. From the ashes of defeat, the Boer guerrilla resistance was born. They were farmers once, fathers, sons. Now they rode in small bands, lean, weathered, and resolute. They had no formal hierarchy, only leaders respected for their cunning and courage. Names like De Wet, Botha, and Smuts became legends in the making. Men who rode without sleep, fought without supply, and refused to kneel. Their tactics were as fluid as the Veld. A British convoy spotted on the horizon would be encircled by dawn. Telegraph poles were cut down in the dark, railroads mined. Outposts attacked without warning. Even when surrounded, the Boers seemed to slip through cracks in the landscape. They carried what they could: ammunition strapped to saddles, biltong dried and wrapped in cloth, rifles cleaned each night with obsessive care. Horses were their lifeblood, and many men knew the names and temperaments of their mounts better than their own brothers. To the British, this new phase of the war was maddening. After the fall of Pretoria, there had been speeches of victory in Parliament, medals struck, honors prepared, but the Boers refused to vanish. They reappeared like mirages. The war had entered a new phase, not glorious, but grinding. And so the Empire responded not with honor, but with hunger. Under Lord Kitchener's command, the British devised a new strategy, the scorched earth policy. It was brutally simple: deny the guerrillas the ability to survive. Farms suspected of aiding commandos were torched. Wheat burned in the fields. Granaries exploded. Orchards axed. Wells were filled with stone or poison. Livestock, cattle, sheep, horses were killed or driven away. Homesteads that had stood for generations were reduced to blackened timbers. From horizon to horizon, smoke curled into the sky. Villages emptied. The land itself seemed to cry out, but no one listened. The aim was clear: cut the guerrillas off from their roots, but the consequences ran deeper than even Kitchener may have foreseen. Tens of thousands of Boer civilians, mostly women and children, were forced from the scorched land, their homes gone, their families hunted. They were packed into what the British called concentration camps. These were not the mechanized horrors of a future century, but they were horrors nonetheless. The camps were overcrowded, hastily constructed, and ill-equipped. Sanitation was poor. Food was scarce. Medicine almost non-existent. Children died in the hundreds from measles, typhoid, dysentery. Mothers wasted away watching them. Simple fevers became death sentences. Emily Hobhouse, a British humanitarian, traveled to South Africa and sounded the alarm. Her reports shocked the public back home. Photographs of emaciated children, of pale women staring blankly into the camera, shook the conscience of an empire. But the war dragged on. The Boers, even with their homes destroyed and families imprisoned, did not surrender. In fact, for many, the war now became more than political. It was personal. Fathers rode out at night knowing their wives were behind barbed wire. Brothers ambushed British columns, driven by grief. The Veld became not just a battlefield, but a memory of what had been taken, a symbol of what could still be defended. One of the most elusive figures of this chapter was General Christian de Wet. He rode like a shadow, slipping through British traps again and again. His men idolized him. The British loathed him and admired him secretly. De Wet seemed to know the land better than any map. He could vanish into the dry riverbeds, reappear 200 miles away, strike a railway, and be gone again before the dust settled. Another was Jan Smuts, who took the war into the British Cape Colony itself, crossing hundreds of miles with a force so tattered and thin that they resembled beggars more than soldiers. Yet they fought like lions. These were not ragtag resistors. They were hardened, intelligent, and terrifyingly committed. And yet, even the fiercest spirit weakens under the weight of years. By late 1901, the British had divided the landscape with a network of blockhouses and barbed wire, stretching like a steel web across the veldt. Thousands of soldiers manned these posts, choking the Boers' ability to move freely. Supplies dwindled. Horses died. Ammunition was precious. The land that once gave life now gave only dust. The guerrilla war had burned bright, and now it began to burn out. Still, they fought, but not forever. In the soft quiet of dawn, when frost glazed the grass and the world turned silver, a man might ask himself what more he could give. Some still chose defiance, others resignation. A few slipped away into exile, their rifles hidden, their boots worn smooth. The war was not yet over, but it was changing once more. In our next chapter, we will walk into the ashes of hope, into the bitter negotiations that would finally bring the war to an end. But at what cost? And with what wounds left behind? By the early months of 1902, South Africa was a land of ghosts. The smoke had lifted from the valleys, but not from the hearts of the people. Trees stood like skeletons. Roads were worn to ruts by columns of marching feet. Rail lines stretched cold and quiet. The world had shifted beneath the boots of soldiers and the hooves of commandos. And now, both friend and foe found themselves asking, how much longer? The Boer commandos, once fierce and fast, had become emaciated bands, fighting not for victory, but for the right to exist. They still rode, yes, but with fewer horses, fewer bullets, and increasingly hollow eyes. The sun still rose over the high Veld, casting long golden rays across the scrub. But the men who once greeted it with defiant hearts now did so with a weariness that reached to the bone. And yet they did not surrender. The British, for their part, had built a cage around the land, lines of blockhouses, barbed wire fences that carved through farms and fields, a system designed not to conquer, but to contain. Still, the embers of resistance glowed. The war had dragged on for nearly 3 years. Thousands of men dead. Tens of thousands of civilians lost to disease and exposure. Millions of pounds spent. The British public, once whipped into a patriotic frenzy, now grumbled with fatigue. Soldiers wrote home about monotony and heat. Officers rotated in and out of command. Politicians in London read casualty reports with furrowed brows. Even Kitchener, the architect of the empire's brute strategy, began to wonder, how much longer could this go on? By March of 1902, the answer began to take shape, not through bullets, but through words. Representatives from both sides, British generals, colonial officials, and Boer leaders, including Louis Botha, Jan Smuts, and Christian de Wet, agreed to meet at a house in Pretoria, and later at a quiet spot known as Melrose House. Here, in shaded rooms heavy with cigar smoke and fatigue, they began the slow and painful process of negotiation. It was not easy. The Boers had lost nearly everything: their capitals, their homes, their farms, their families, and yet they wanted dignity. They wanted some thread of sovereignty. They wanted a future that was not written by empire alone. The British, exhausted and wary of dragging the conflict any further, sought peace, but peace on their terms. For weeks, talks dragged. Lines were drawn, erased, and drawn again. Voices were raised, tempers flared, and through it all, the memory of every fallen child, every burned farmhouse, every horse shot in the field, all of it loomed over the room like smoke that would not clear. In the end, compromise, if such a word fits this moment, prevailed. On the evening of May 31st, 1902, the Treaty of Vereeniging was signed. The Second Boer War was over. Its terms were grim, but final. The South African Republic and the Orange Free State would cease to exist as independent republics. They would become part of the British Empire. In return, the British agreed to certain conditions. Amnesty would be granted to Boer fighters. The use of Dutch and later Afrikaans would be permitted in courts and schools. Funds, £3 million, would be allocated to help rebuild Boer farms, though many argued it was not enough. Most notably, the issue of enfranchising the native African population was postponed, a choice that would cast a long shadow over South Africa's future. The Boer leaders, with trembling pens and aching hands, signed, not in triumph, nor in surrender, but in silence. Outside, the wind moved through the long grass, as if bearing witness to the end of something vast and terrible. The next day, across the land, men stepped out of their tents and trenches, many barefoot, many hollow-eyed, and slowly laid down their arms. Some wept, some stared into the dust, as if searching for the homes they had lost. British officers, grim and respectful, supervised the surrender with hats off and rifles lowered. There were no parades, no bands played, just silence, a kind of mourning dressed in khaki. The war was over, but peace would be another matter entirely. The land was scarred, not just in the obvious ways, the ruins, the scorched fields, the graves, but in the deeper, quieter wounds that mark a people forever changed. Fathers came home to empty farmsteads. Mothers searched for children lost in the camps. Whole villages had vanished. Entire generations carried stories that would not be spoken aloud for years. Stories of defiance, of fire, of grief, and yet South Africa breathed. It would not be the same country again. The seeds of future strife had already been planted in the racial policies left untouched, in the bitterness between Afrikaner and Briton, in the memory of war turned to myth. But for a time, there was rest. The rifles were oiled and stored, the horses unsaddled. The dust, at last, began to settle. In our next chapter, we will drift through the aftermath, through the long years of rebuilding, memory, and the rewriting of identity, a time when war moved from fire to shadow, and the stories of those who lived through it were slowly folded into the fabric of a changing South Africa. The guns had fallen silent. The smoke had drifted away, but in South Africa, the true weight of the Boer War was only beginning to press down. There are wars that leave nations broken, and then there are wars that leave them hollowed. What the people of the Transvaal and Orange Free State returned to after 1902 was not a country as they remembered it, but the ruins of a dream. Burned fields, blackened chimneys standing alone where houses once stood, livestock gone, wells poisoned, and those who had survived, thin, haunted, changed. For the Boers, surrender had come not in spirit, but in necessity. But how do you rebuild when everything you once owned, your land, your livelihood, even your memories, has been reduced to ash? The British, as promised in the Treaty of Vereeniging, committed funds to help Boer families rebuild. £3 million was allocated, a considerable sum, but one spread thin across the thousands of ruined farms and impoverished families, and not all were eager to accept imperial help. For many Boers, taking British assistance felt like swallowing pride again and again. With every stone laid and every furrow plowed anew, still the land remained the vast, harsh, sunburnt landscape that had always been both ally and adversary. Slowly, the people returned to it. They planted what seeds they could salvage. They dug new wells. They taught children again, often in makeshift classrooms beneath trees or in the corners of barns that hadn't burned. There was resilience, yes, but also deep, quiet anger among Afrikaners. A sense of cultural identity began to solidify, forged in grief and the memory of loss. The war, once simply a struggle over sovereignty, had become a kind of national crucible. Songs were sung, poems written, tales of gallant commandos and tragic heroines passed from one generation to the next. Afrikaans, once considered merely a spoken dialect, began to emerge as a language of defiance, of memory. Mothers whispered it to their children in the dark, long after the camps, long after the fires. But the divisions left by the war weren't only between Boers and British. The black South African population, whose involvement had been largely unrecognized, now found themselves in a deeply complex and unequal society. Over 100,000 black Africans had been drawn into the war. Some served as laborers, others as scouts, servants, even unarmed auxiliaries for both sides. They had lost homes, livelihoods, and loved ones. But when the treaty was signed, their rights were not discussed. They were not present at the table. The document that ended the war made no provision for their enfranchisement. The lines between colonizer and colonized deepened in silence. In the countryside, black farm workers returned to find themselves pushed further to the margins. Some had been promised land or compensation for their wartime service. Most received neither, and so, while the white population struggled with grief and identity, black South Africans faced the compounded burden of being both forgotten and dispossessed. The legacy of this would shape the soul of the country for generations to come. Meanwhile, the British began integrating the newly annexed republics into their empire more fully. Civil administrations were set up. English became the language of government, and yet there was caution. The British had learned, through bitter experience, that conquest did not equal consent. Leaders like Louis Botha and Jan Smuts, who had once led commando raids against British soldiers, now entered the world of politics. Surprisingly, they were not driven solely by vengeance, but by vision. They believed South Africa could be more than a battleground, that it could be a nation of its own, even within the imperial structure. In 1910, just 8 years after the war's end, the Union of South Africa was born, a self-governing dominion under the British Crown. It united the former Boer republics with the Cape Colony and Natal, but this union came at a cost. To achieve political harmony between British and Afrikaners, a price was paid, and it was paid by the black majority. Racial segregation, land dispossession, and legal inequality were woven into the very fabric of the new state. The seeds of apartheid were not planted overnight, but here, in the quiet years after the war, they were sown quietly, deliberately, in laws, in land acts, in the slow but deliberate erasure of black South Africans from the political future. Yet, even in this darkness, resistance stirred. Across the country, black intellectuals, community leaders, and workers began organizing, meeting in churches, publishing in small newspapers, building networks. Out of these efforts, the South African Native National Congress would rise in 1912, the early predecessor to what would become the African National Congress, ANC. The scars of the Boer War would remain visible in memorials and graveyards, in songs sung on lonely farms, in the empty places where families had once lived. But its deepest scars were not in stone or soil. They were in the minds of those who had lived through it, in the stories passed down by grandparents, in the inherited silences. For some, the war was remembered as a tragedy. For others, it was a badge of pride, and for many, particularly the black population, it was remembered not for the battles, but for the way they were erased from the story altogether. As South Africa stumbled into the 20th century, into union, into industrialization, into deeper social division, the Boer War became something more than history. It became myth. It became memory. It became a mirror that each group would look into and see something different. In our next chapter, we will explore how that memory evolved, how a war fought with rifles and horses transformed into legend, into politics, into the very heart of a divided nation. It is a strange thing how the mind holds on to war, not as it was, not in blood nor hunger, nor the sharp crack of rifle fire, but as something quieter, something that lingers in story, in silence, in the long look of an old man staring across an open field. By the 1920s, the Boer War was no longer the headline of the day, no longer the urgent concern of empire or rebel. The Union of South Africa had been formed. The dust had settled, and with it, so had the need to reflect. But when a people begin to remember, they seldom do so without shaping the past into something they can carry. And so, the Boer War began its second life, not as history, but as memory. Across the Karoo and the Veld, Families gathered under corrugated iron roofs and told stories by candlelight of uncles who had ridden with De Wet, of grandmothers who had hidden rifles under floorboards, of young boys who had snuck food past British patrols to feed the commandos in the hills. These stories, part truth, part reverence, became a kind of oral scripture. They were not taught in schools, nor written in books. They were whispered, generation after generation, with pauses where the voices broke, and long silences for the names no longer spoken. The Afrikaner people, in particular, shaped the war into a pillar of cultural identity. What had begun as a desperate defense of two fledgling republics transformed, in memory, into something mythic. A struggle for freedom against the weight of empire, a crucible that tested the very soul of a people. In this new telling, the Boer fighter became a romantic figure, brave, lean, sunburnt, and always just out of reach of the redcoats. The Veld became more than landscape, it became sacred, and the war camps, once scenes of unspeakable loss, were transformed into symbols of martyrdom and endurance. It was during these years that monuments began to rise. Simple crosses on lonely hills, granite statues in village squares, names carved in stone, not just of men who had died in battle, but of women and children who had perished in the camps. The most solemn of these would come in 1913, just outside Bloemfontein, the Women's Monument, a tall obelisk surrounded by weeping statues. It marked a moment of collective grief that had long gone unspoken. Thousands attended its unveiling. Old commandos with limp arms, widows in black, children who had been born long after the war, but who had grown up in its long shadow. The speeches that day were not of politics nor conquest. They were of survival, of faith, of the sacred duty to remember. But memory is not neutral. While the Afrikaner community remembered the war as a fight for freedom, British South Africans remembered it differently, often with pride. They recalled the empire's victory, the expansion of dominion, the hard-earned triumph of British tenacity over rugged rebellion. Their monuments were different. Neat rows of white graves maintained by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, stone lions and Union Jacks fluttering in military cemeteries, honor rolls inside Anglican churches, and then, beyond both narratives, stood the forgotten majority, Black South Africans who had lived through the war, worked for both sides, died in the shadows of both camps, but whose stories were seldom carved in stone or sung in the national hymns. Their memory of the war was not one of flags or freedom, but of fire, their homes razed, their livestock taken, their names omitted from the treaties that reshaped the land. For them, the war was not over in 1902. Its consequences bled into every law, every land act, every fence that divided fertile soil from barren township. For decades, their voices would remain quiet, not by choice, but by design. In schools, the war was taught through a colonial lens. British victories were emphasized. The concentration camps were often downplayed or softened. The role of Black South Africans, laborers, scouts, guides, victims, was absent, and yet the memory persisted. In homes, in stories passed quietly between elders, in resentment, in survival, memory is political. It is shaped by who tells the story and who is allowed to forget. By the 1940s, with the world once again plunged into global conflict, the Boer War became a symbol used by both political movements and cultural revivalists. The rise of Afrikaner nationalism saw a surge in interest in the war's memory. School books changed. Statues were cleaned. Afrikaans poetry flourished. In this cultural revival, the suffering of the war was not forgotten. It was sanctified. The trauma of defeat, of scorched farms and starving families, was transformed into a kind of rallying cry. The Afrikaner people, once divided and defeated, began to see themselves as a chosen people, tempered by fire. This myth of endurance and divine struggle would soon shape the political destiny of the country, leading to policies that sought to preserve Afrikaner identity at the cost of deepening racial division. Even as the world moved on, as radios played new music, as cities rose from the Veld, the story of the Boer War remained, not always spoken aloud. Sometimes just a photograph on the mantle, a name etched on a pocket Bible, a grandfather's eyes when he stared too long at the horizon. South Africa had changed, yes, but beneath its soil, memory stirred like a root system beneath a tree, unseen, but always alive. In the next chapter, we'll walk through the long, difficult road from memory to politics. How the shadows of war came to shape policy, language, power, and ultimately the architecture of division in 20th century South Africa. By the time the 20th century had drawn into its middle decades, the Boer War was no longer just a story passed between generations. It had become something more potent, a narrative, and one that political architects would shape into a foundation stone. The past, they say, is never dead. In South Africa, the past was a living blueprint. The Union of South Africa, created in 1910, had brought together British and Boer territories into one state, but it was a unity forged in compromise and silence. The promises of reconciliation were spoken mostly between white leaders. In the background, the majority of the population, Black, colored, and Indian South Africans, remained excluded from political participation, their futures decided in rooms they would never enter. But among Afrikaners, the trauma of the Boer War, especially the memory of humiliation, fed a growing desire for self-determination, not just culturally, but politically. There was a generation of children who had grown up in the ashes of the war, who had watched their parents rebuild, who had heard whispered tales of defiance and survival. These children became the men and women who, in the 1920s and 1930s, entered the civil service, the schools, the church pulpits, and the political parties of a new South Africa. And with them came the ghosts of the war, not just to be remembered, but to be avenged. Afrikaner nationalism was in many ways born out of loss. The image of the humble, God-fearing Boer farmer, persecuted by the British, dispossessed of land and liberty, became the central myth of this new political identity. The war, in their eyes, had not ended in 1902. Its struggle continued in the preservation of Afrikaner culture, language, and independence. By the 1930s, political movements like the National Party gained strength by invoking this very legacy. Their leaders, many of them descendants of Boer fighters, used the memory of the war to frame their cause as a continuation of resistance against imperial domination. Only now dressed in new clothes, the dominance of English, the economic power of the mining elite, the cultural supremacy of British norms. Language became a battlefield. Afrikaans, once dismissed as a kitchen dialect, was formalized, standardized, and elevated to an official language alongside English. Schools began to teach it. Newspapers printed it. Churches preached in it. Every institution that could carry the soul of the Afrikaner was enlisted in the cause of cultural revival. And beneath it all, beneath the surface of language and literature, the quiet undercurrent of resentment stirred. It is important to understand. The myth of victimhood, once turned inward, can become dangerous when directed outward. When the National Party won the 1948 election, the memory of the Boer War was not forgotten. It had become an engine. The victory was seen not just as a political shift, but as a reclamation. The descendants of the defeated had, in their minds, finally taken back the reins of power. And now, they would shape South Africa in their image. What followed was one of the most notorious and systematic implementations of racial segregation in modern history: apartheid. But apartheid did not arrive overnight, nor did it appear without ideological roots. It had, in part, grown in the soil left scorched by the Boer War. The architects of apartheid believed deeply in preserving their volk, their people, their culture, their identity, from what they viewed as the twin threats of British cultural hegemony and black political equality. In their minds, both were forms of domination. And so, the answer they created was a system that institutionalized separation, restriction, and control. Land was divided. Passbooks were issued. Voting rights were stripped. Neighborhoods were bulldozed. Generations of families were told where they could live, work, worship, and even love, all in the name of preserving what the victors of 1948 saw as their sacred inheritance. It was a cruel irony that a war fought under the banner of independence would be remembered by some as justification for the oppression of others. The suffering once endured in the concentration camps, the deaths of women and children, the indignities of occupation, had hardened into a belief that any threat to Afrikaner identity was an existential one. And in this belief, the memory of the war was often invoked, solemnly and with righteous certainty. You could see it in the speeches of nationalist leaders who referenced British betrayals and heroic Boer martyrs. You could see it in school textbooks, which taught the war as a moral struggle of David versus Goliath, with Britain as the tyrant and the Boer as the pious shepherd. You could see it in public monuments, in carefully curated museum exhibitions, and in the cultural organizations that emphasized the uniqueness and superiority of Afrikaner civilization. But history, once bent into myth, begins to forget itself. Lost were the stories of Black South Africans who had also suffered in the war. Forgotten were the thousands who had died in racially segregated camps, who had fought, labored, resisted, and endured without recognition. Their history was not woven into the national story. It was kept out of classrooms, erased from policy, ignored by monuments, and yet it lived on, in oral traditions, in resistance poetry, in church hymns and protest chants. Memory cannot be so easily crushed, even when history books fall silent. As apartheid deepened through the 1950s and 60s, a new generation of South Africans, across all racial and cultural lines, began to question the narrative. Activists, scholars, artists, and exiles began to peel back the myths of the past, to ask difficult questions about the true legacy of the Boer War and how its memory had been used not to unite a nation, but to divide it. By the late 20th century, those questions would grow louder, bolder, and they would shake the very foundations of the system built atop the bones of that long-ago conflict. In the final chapter of our journey, we'll step into the modern day to examine how the memory of the Boer War continues to echo through contemporary South Africa, through its politics, its literature, its reconciliations, and its unresolved ghosts. The night is quieter now, not because the world has stilled, but because we have walked so far from the fire lines of that distant war that its gunshots no longer echo as thunder, but as whispers carried on the wind. And yet they are still there. The Boer War is over. It ended more than a century ago. But in South Africa, the past is never truly past. It lingers in stone and soil, in names whispered in family homes, in the weight of policies once written in the ink of old hatreds. The war may have ended in 1902, but its afterlife still walks among us, in memory, in monuments, and in the unresolved tension between remembrance and truth. Today, South Africa is a democratic republic, vibrant, wounded, proud, and still healing. Its cities pulse with life. Johannesburg rises with steel and glass. Cape Town glimmers between sea and mountain. Pretoria hums with government and ghosts. But beneath the surfaces, in the way land is owned, in the stories taught at school, in the languages spoken in parliament and playgrounds, the imprint of the Boer War quietly remains. The legacy of that war is not a singular thing. It is a mirror, and what you see in it depends on where you stand. For some, it is still a tale of defiance, the proud story of a small people resisting a mighty empire, a cornerstone of Afrikaner identity, a symbol of strength, of faith, of survival against all odds. For others, it is a warning, a war fought between two white powers on black soil, with little thought to the millions who lived, toiled, and died in their shadow. A precursor to dispossession, to apartheid, to decades of systemic exclusion, and for many, especially among the younger generation, it is something unfamiliar. A footnote in history books, a name on a monument, a war that feels ancient, disconnected, and yet still oddly present, like a scent in the air you can't quite place. Modern South Africa has made great efforts to reconcile its past. Since the fall of apartheid in 1994, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission sought to confront the horrors of more recent decades. But even that process, for all its emotional courage, largely left the Boer War unexamined. Too old, perhaps, too politically thorny, too many overlapping truths. But history does not wait for permission to be remembered. In recent years, a quieter reckoning has begun. Historians, poets, and artists have returned to the war, not to glorify, but to understand. New research has emerged, especially into the lives and deaths of Black South Africans during the conflict. For decades, their names had been absent from the memorials. Now they are being recovered, piece by piece, name by name. In small towns, community projects are restoring old cemeteries and telling forgotten stories. In universities, lectures are being held that explore how the war shaped not just soldiers and statesmen, but shepherds, teachers, mothers, and orphans. There is a hunger, especially among young people, to understand where this all began, to trace the thread of inequality back through time, to ask, how did we get here? Because the Boer War, in so many ways, was the first draft of modern South Africa. It introduced the concentration camp to the world. It redefined guerrilla warfare. It set the stage for union and for apartheid. It revealed the immense cruelty that empires can justify in the name of civilization. But it also revealed the endurance of the human spirit, the quiet heroism of women in camp kitchens, the faith of families that lost everything and still rebuilt, the ability of a wounded people to transform grief into identity. Not all of that identity was used for good. Some of it hardened into exclusion, into ideology. But memory, like all tools, reflects the hand that holds it. As South Africa continues to evolve, the memory of the Boer War becomes not less important, but more, because to understand this country, truly, you must walk the paths where its earliest wounds were opened. To understand why land remains such a fiercely contested issue. To understand why language carries such weight. To understand why reconciliation is not a destination, but a process, long, painful, and necessary. It is telling that in the post-apartheid era, many South Africans across backgrounds have begun to look at the Boer War not as a symbol of one group's suffering, but as a shared tragedy, a crucible that scarred everyone, though not equally. A moment in time where choices were made that still echo today. And perhaps that is where the hope lies. In the slow, steady realization that remembering does not mean returning, that to face the past is not to be trapped by it, but to be freed by its lessons. That a history once written in blood can be rewritten in understanding. Across the Veld, the battlefields are quiet now. The graves are tended. The names are known, and the sky above them is wide and endless, as it always was, watching, waiting, carrying the dreams of those still walking this land. So if tonight, as you lie in bed, you feel the distant stirrings of time, know that they are not meant to unsettle, but to connect. You have walked through a great history, one of pain, yes, but also of endurance, of identity, of the ever-evolving soul of a country still learning how to carry its past. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening, not just with your ears, but with your heart. Sleep well now, traveler. May your dreams be filled with quiet stars and the soft wind across an open field. Good night.